Wren Calloway didn't know that the man she'd sent riding in circles through the Grey Wild Pass for 3 days was the Alpha King of the Northern Dominion. She didn't know that the worn leather map she'd altered, the one with the river crossing moved 2 miles east, and the ridge trail looped back on itself like a serpent eating its own tail, had been purchased by the most powerful wolf shifter on the continent. All she knew was that someone from the capital had been asking questions in her village about the mountain routes. And anyone from the capital asking questions about mountain routes meant one thing. They were coming to take the land. So she'd done what she always did when powerful men came sniffing around the Harrowvale border. She lied with ink and parchment instead of words, because words could be challenged but maps were trusted. Maps were gospel. And Wren Calloway drew the best maps in the Eastern Territories. She was kneeling in the dirt outside her cottage, re-inking a territorial survey for the village elder, when the horse came through the tree line. Not trotting, not cantering. Walking with the slow, deliberate exhaustion of an animal that had been ridden hard through terrain that made no sense. Its coat was dark with dried sweat, its head low, and the man on its back looked like he'd been dragged through 3 days of forest and come out the other side with nothing but fury and a very specific question. He was tall. That was the first thing she noticed, even before he dismounted, because the height of him changed the shape of the space between the trees. Broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke of muscle earned through use rather than vanity, wearing a dark, long-sleeve riding coat that had seen better days, the fabric torn at one sleeve and smeared with pine resin and mud. His dark hair was pushed back from a face that was all sharp angles and hard lines, a jaw that could have been carved from the mountain rock he'd been circling, and when he looked at her, his eyes were the color of deep forest, green and dark and absolutely furious. He swung down from the horse with a grace that didn't match his exhaustion, landed on both feet, and walked toward her, with the kind of stride that ate ground without hurrying, every step precise, every movement controlled. Like a man who had learned to keep his rage on a very short leash. Wren's hand tightened around her ink brush. She knew that coat. She knew those riding boots. Expensive but practical. The kind the King's Rangers wore. She knew, with the sudden cold certainty of someone who has just made a very large mistake, exactly who had bought her doctored map. "You're the cartographer," he said. Not a question. His voice was low, rough from disuse or exhaustion or both, and it scraped across her skin like the edge of a blade drawn slow across parchment. Wren stood. She was not tall. She was, in fact, the kind of small that people underestimated, which she'd long ago decided was less a disadvantage and more a weapon. She lifted her chin and met those green eyes and felt something shift in her chest, something that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a sensation she couldn't name, a tug, faint but insistent, like a compass needle trying to find north. "Depends on who's asking," she said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. Her parchment. She recognized the specific shade of walnut ink she'd used, the particular weight of the paper she pressed herself from birch pulp. He unfolded it with the careful precision of a man handling evidence and held it up between them. "3 days," he said. "I have been riding through the same stretch of forest for 3 days because this map," he tapped the parchment with one long finger, "shows a pass that doesn't exist, a river that runs the wrong direction, and a trail that circles back to the same clearing 4 times. He paused. Let the silence settle like snowfall. I counted. Wren's pulse hammered, but she kept her face still. 3 years of selling maps to strangers had taught her how to lie with her whole body, and she stood in the fading afternoon light with her ink-stained fingers and her steady expression and said, "The Grey Wild is difficult terrain. Even experienced riders get turned around. I don't get turned around. Everyone gets turned around in the Grey Wild. I tracked a wounded stag through the Black Vein marshes in the dark when I was 14. He folded the map with deliberate slowness and tucked it back into his coat. I don't get turned around. Your map is wrong. Maps can have errors. Not 4 of them. Not 4 errors that all happen to create a perfect loop. He took a step closer. Then another. She held her ground, even though every instinct was screaming at her to step back, because there was something about the way he moved that her body recognized on a level beneath thought, beneath logic, beneath the careful architecture of self-preservation she'd built over 23 years of surviving on the edges of territories that didn't want her. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that she could smell him. Pine and horse sweat, and something underneath that was warm and deep and entirely, impossibly familiar, like a scent she'd known in a dream and forgotten upon waking. Your map, he said quietly, is not wrong. It's a lie. She should have denied it. She should have gasped, looked offended, clutched her survey tools to her chest and protested that Wren Calloway's maps were the most accurate in 4 territories, which they were, when she wanted them to be. But he was looking at her with those dark green eyes, and the tug in her chest had become a pull, steady and warm, like a thread being drawn taut between her ribs and his, and the lie died on her tongue. Yes, she said. His eyebrows rose, just slightly, as though he'd been expecting the denial and hadn't quite prepared for honesty. I marked your map wrong on purpose. Silence. The horse behind him shifted its weight and blew out a long, tired breath. Somewhere in the forest, a woodpecker hammered against bark. The light was going amber through the trees, turning everything gold and soft, which felt like a cruel contrast to the conversation she was having. Why? He asked. And that was the question, wasn't it? The question that held everything. The question she answered by lifting her chin higher and squaring her narrow shoulders and saying, with a steadiness she did not entirely feel, because the last 3 men who came through here asking about mountain routes worked for the Crown. And the last time Crown surveyors mapped this territory, the village on the other side of the ridge lost its grazing lands, its water access, and half its population to resettlement orders. She held his gaze. I'm not letting that happen to Harrowvale. Something changed in his face. Not softening exactly. More like a door opening a crack where she'd expected a wall. You sabotaged a royal map, he said, to protect a village. I sabotaged your map to protect my village, my home, the only place in 4 territories that doesn't charge me rent for existing. He stared at her. She stared back. The pull between them hummed like a plucked string, and she didn't understand it. Didn't want to understand it, because understanding it would mean acknowledging that something about this furious, beautiful, terrifyingly calm man was reaching through every defense she had and finding the soft places she'd spent years trying to wall off. You should know, he said, his voice dropping to something quieter, something almost careful. That I'm not a surveyor. I know what you are, King's Ranger. The coat gives it away. A pause. Something flickered across his expression. Not amusement exactly. Something adjacent to it. Something that lived next door. I'm not a ranger either. Wren's stomach dropped. She felt it physically, a lurch beneath her ribs, because the alternative to ranger was something she hadn't considered, something she'd dismissed as impossible, because men like that didn't ride alone through mountain passes on tired horses with torn sleeves and mud on their boots. Then who are you? He didn't answer immediately. He looked at her for a long moment, those forest green eyes unreadable. And then he said, My name is Dominic Ashvane. The name hit her like cold water. Ashvane. The Ashvane bloodline. The family that had held the Northern Dominion for 6 generations, that commanded the largest pack territory on the continent, that ruled from the Iron Summit and answered to no council, no parliament, no one. You're the Alpha King, she whispered. I am. And I sent you riding in circles for 3 days. You did. She waited for the fury, for the cold command, the threat, the seizure of her tools and her cottage and her freedom. She waited for the thing that powerful men always did when they were made to look foolish, which was to make someone else suffer for it. Dominic Ashvan, Alpha King of the Northern Dominion, looked at her with those impossible green eyes and said, "I'm going to need a place to water my horse." She blinked. "And food, if you have it. 3 days of circling a non-existent pass has left me somewhat short on provisions." He paused. "I ate the last of my dried meat this morning while staring at a river that your map assured me ran north, which it does not. It runs west. I'm aware of that now." Something cracked in her chest. Not fear, not relief. Something worse. Something that felt dangerously close to respect. She led him to the stream behind her cottage. He watered the horse while she stood 3 paces away and tried to reconcile the Alpha King of the Northern Dominion with the man who was currently murmuring soft words to his exhausted mount and running a careful hand down its foreleg to check for swelling. Kings didn't do that. Kings had grooms, stable masters, entire staffs dedicated to the care of their animals. They didn't kneel in the mud beside a stream and press their ear to a horse's chest to listen to its breathing. "He's sound," Dominic said without looking up. "Tired, but sound. You chose a good route for your deception. Difficult enough to exhaust, but not dangerous enough to injure. I didn't want anyone hurt. I just wanted them gone." He stood, wiping his hands on his ruined coat, and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "That's the second time you've been honest with me when lying would have served you better. I'm a terrible liar. You're an exceptional liar. You lied with mathematics and ink, and the specific manipulation of topographic landmarks. That's not terrible lying. That's artistry." He held her gaze. "You're just choosing not to lie to me, and I'd like to know why." She didn't have an answer for that. Or rather, she did. But the answer was the tug in her chest and the compass needle pull that seemed to always point toward him. And she was not about to explain that to the Alpha King she'd just confessed to sabotaging. He stayed. That was the part that didn't make sense. He watered his horse, accepted the bread and dried venison she offered, and then sat on the bench outside her cottage while the sun went down and asked her about the Greywild as though he hadn't just been lost in it for 3 days because of her. Not angry questions, curious ones. How the passes shifted in winter. Where the game trails diverged from the trading roads. Why the river changed course after the spring thaw. She answered because she didn't know how not to. Cartography was the only language she'd ever been fluent in, and he was asking her to speak it, and the words came out the way water finds its level, natural, and inevitable. "You know this land better than anyone I've encountered," he said when the first stars appeared. His voice had lost its edge. Not soft, not gentle, just honest, in the way of a man who had no practice at flattery, and therefore only said things he meant. "I've walked every mile of it. Alone? Always alone." He looked at her in the gathering dark, and the firelight from inside the cottage caught the angles of his face and turned his eyes to something luminous. "That sounds lonely." "Lonely is safe." "Is it?" She didn't answer, because the truth was complicated, and the truth was that she'd been alone for so long that she'd forgotten it was a choice, and this man, this impossible, infuriating man, who should have arrested her or banished her or burned her maps, and her cottage, and her entire livelihood to ash, was sitting on her bench and asking her about loneliness like he recognized it. He slept in the barn. She offered nothing better, and he asked for nothing better. And when she lay awake in her narrow bed and pressed her hand to her sternum, she could feel the pull like a low vibration, a hum beneath her heartbeat that she was terrified to name. The next morning she found him in her workshop. She should have been angry. The workshop was her sanctuary, the only room in the cottage that mattered, crammed with half-finished maps and survey tools, and the painstaking territorial records she'd been compiling for 3 years. But he wasn't touching anything. He was standing in front of the large map pinned to her east wall, the one that showed the entire Grey Wild and every territory that bordered it, and he was studying it with the focus of a man who understood what he was looking at. "This is extraordinary," he said without turning around. "That's not for sale. I'm not trying to buy it. I'm trying to understand it." He traced a line with his finger, not touching the parchment, hovering just above it. "You've mapped water sources that aren't on any official survey. Migration patterns, soil variations." He turned to look at her. "This isn't a map, it's a living document. The land is alive. Maps should be too." He held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary, and the compass needle in her chest swung hard toward him, and she gripped the doorframe to keep herself still. "I wasn't sent here to take your village's land," he said. "I came because 3 of my border patrols have gotten lost in the Grey Wild in the last year. I was trying to find out why the existing maps are so unreliable." The floor tilted beneath her feet. "You were trying to fix the maps?" "Yes. And I gave you a broken one. A spectacularly broken one." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the ghost of one. "I've been lost before. I've been ambushed, poisoned, and once thrown from a cliff by a very angry territorial dispute. I have never been sent in a perfect circle by a cartographer with a grudge. It wasn't a grudge, it was self-preservation." "I know." He said it simply, without judgment. "That's what makes it remarkable. You didn't attack me, you didn't flee. You turned my own tools against me with precision and patience, and if I'd been anyone else, it would have worked. I would have given up and gone home, and your village would have been safe. But you didn't give up. I never give up." They looked at each other across the small, cluttered room full of maps and ink and the accumulated geography of a woman's solitary life, and the air between them felt charged, heavy with something that had no name, but pulled like gravity. "Dominic," she said, and the name felt strange and right in her mouth, like a word she'd always known but never spoken. His pupils dilated. She saw it happen, the dark centers of his green eyes expanding, and his jaw tightened, and his hands, which had been loose at his sides, curled slowly into fists, not with anger, with restraint. "Don't," he said very quietly. "Don't what?" "Don't say my name like that unless you mean it." Her heart slammed against her ribs. "Like what?" "Like you know me." She should have stepped back. She should have laughed it off, deflected, retreated into the safety of distance and distrust. Instead, she stood in the doorway of her workshop with her ink-stained fingers and her thundering pulse and said, "I do know you. I've known you since you knelt beside the stream and checked your horse's breathing instead of demanding I be punished. I've known you since you sat on my bench and asked about the river instead of issuing decrees. I've known you since you slept in my barn without complaint and didn't touch a single one of my maps even though you could have taken them all." His breathing had changed. She could hear it. Shorter, rougher. "That's not knowing someone," he said. "That's observing them. It's the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. It's what I do. I observe the land and I know it. I map it. I learn its patterns, its rhythms, the places where it's vulnerable and the places where it's strong." She swallowed hard. "You're the same. Your terrain I'm trying to read, and every time I think I've found the edge of you, there's more." He crossed the room in 3 strides. Not fast, deliberate, each step a choice, each step a question, giving her time to retreat, to say no, to slam the door she was standing in. She didn't move. He stopped so close that she could feel the heat rolling off his body, could smell the pine and earth and that deep, warm scent that her entire nervous system recognized as home. "Wren," he said, and the way he said her name turned it into something sacred, something that vibrated in the space between them like the lowest note on a struck bell. "I'm still the woman who sent you riding in circles for 3 days." "I know. I'd do it again." "I know that too." His hand came up, slowly, giving her time. His fingers brushed the line of her jaw, and the touch sent a bolt of heat through her body that settled low and warm in the pit of her stomach. And the compass needle pull in her chest locked into place with a click she swore she could hear. "You're my mate," he said. "Not a question. A discovery. An arrival. I figured that out around the time you didn't arrest me." He almost smiled. Almost. The restraint in it, the way he held it back like a man holding a door against a storm, was the most devastating thing she'd ever seen. I thought about it. Arresting me? For about 30 seconds. Then you lifted your chin and told me you'd sabotaged a king to protect your home, and I realized I'd been riding in circles in more ways than one. She kissed him. She didn't plan it. She rose on her toes and grabbed the front of his ruined coat and pulled him down, and the moment her mouth met his, the world caught fire. Not the reckless blaze of something uncontrolled, but the deep, steady burn of a forge, something that would shape rather than destroy. His hands found her waist, then her back, pulling her against him with a gentleness that contradicted the raw hunger she could feel in the tension of his body, in the tremor that ran through his arms as he held her. He kissed her like a man drinking water after 3 days in the desert, like a man who had been lost and had finally found the thing he'd been circling toward all along. When they broke apart, his forehead was pressed to hers, his breathing ragged, his hands shaking against her spine. "Your maps," he said roughly, "are going to be the death of me. You survived 3 days." The 3 days were nothing. He pulled back far enough to look at her, and his eyes were dark and burning. "It's the next 50 years I'm worried about." She laughed. Actually laughed. And the sound surprised them both, filling the small workshop with something that felt like sunlight, and he stared at her with an expression of absolute wonder, as though her laughter was a country he'd never visited and never wanted to leave. They didn't resolve everything that day, or the next. He told her about the border disputes, the territorial conflicts that were bleeding his patrols dry because no one could navigate the Greywild reliably. She told him about Harrowvale, about the village on the other side of the ridge, about the families who had lost their land to resettlement orders, and the fear that lived in every border community like a second heartbeat. He listened, not the way kings listened, which was usually with half an ear while planning their response. He listened with his whole body, leaned forward, eyes on hers, asking questions that showed he understood not just the facts, but the fear beneath them. "Come with me," he said on the third evening, as they sat by the fire in her cottage, his shoulder touching hers, the bond between them humming like a wire in the wind. "Come to the Iron Summit. Bring your maps. Show my council what you showed me." "Your council won't listen to a border cartographer. They'll listen to the woman who outsmarted their king." He turned to look at her, and the firelight turned his green eyes to something molten. "And if they don't, I'll make them." "That's not how this works." "How does it work?" "I show them the data, the real maps, the ones that show what the resettlement orders did to the land, the water depletion, the soil degradation, the migration shifts. I give them proof they can't ignore." She met his gaze. "I don't need you to make anyone listen. I need you to give me the room to speak." He was quiet for a long moment, and she watched the firelight play across the planes of his face, and she felt the bond between them pulse with something that was neither desire nor devotion, but something deeper. Recognition. The understanding that they were two people shaped by different pressures into complementary forms, like a key and a lock, like a river and the canyon it carved. "Done," he said. "You'll have the room, you'll have the council's time, and you'll have my protection, not because you need it, but because anyone who threatens you threatens me, and I'd like to see them try." The journey to the Iron Summit took 6 days. 6 days of riding together through the Greywild she knew like her own breath, past the landmarks she'd mapped and the ones she'd hidden, through the passes she'd memorized and the trails she'd created. She showed him the real Greywild, the one that existed beneath the sabotaged maps, and he rode beside her with an expression of quiet amazement that he thought he was hiding but wasn't. On the fourth night, bandits came, not random outlaws, random, organized, armed. 8 riders in dark leather, carrying the brand of Lord Fennec Hale, the territorial governor who had signed the resettlement orders that destroyed the Ridge village. They came out of the trees like shadows, surrounding the small camp where Wren and Dominic had stopped for the night, and the leader, a thick-necked man with a scar bisecting his left ear, looked at Wren and smiled. "The cartographer," he said. "Lord Hale's been looking for you. Seems someone's been selling false maps to royal travelers, and the governor would very much like to discuss that." Wren's blood went cold. Hale. The name alone was enough to make her hands shake, because Fennec Hale was the man who had signed the orders, who had profited from the land seizures, who had built his estate on the bones of displaced families and never lost a night's sleep over it. She felt Dominic go still beside her. Not the stillness of fear, the stillness of a predator deciding how to strike. "Lord Hale sent 8 men," Dominic said conversationally, "to collect 1 cartographer." The leader's smile faltered. Something about the tone, something about the absolute absence of fear in it. "Who are you?" "I'm the man she sent riding in circles for 3 days." Dominic stood slowly, and the motion had a quality to it that made 2 of the horses step back, their riders tightening their grips on the reins. "If you know her well enough to track her, you should know me well enough to leave. We don't answer to travelers. You answer to the crown." He said it quietly, without raising his voice, and the authority in it was like a physical weight pressing down on the clearing. "And I am the crown." The silence that followed was absolute. Wren watched the recognition ripple through the group, watched faces go from smug to uncertain to openly afraid. The scar-eared leader's hand moved toward his sword, then stopped, because Dominic's eyes had changed. The green gone darker, the pupils narrowed to vertical slits, and the air around him vibrated with a power that pressed against Wren's skin like the charge before a lightning strike. "Tell your lord," Dominic said, each word carved from stone, "that the cartographer is under my protection. Tell him that his territorial activities are now under royal investigation. And tell him that if he sends another man after her, the next person who comes for him won't be a messenger." They left, all 8 of them, melting back into the trees with the speed of men who have realized, too late, that they have picked a fight with something that could end them. Wren stood in the clearing with her fists clenched and her heart racing and the taste of old fear like copper on her tongue. "You're shaking," Dominic said. "I'm angry. You're scared." "I'm both." She turned to face him, and the tears she'd been holding back for 3 years, since the Ridge village, since the displacement orders, since she'd started falsifying maps as the only weapon available to a woman with no army, no allies, and no power, broke through the last of her defenses. "I'm so tired of being scared." He opened his arms, didn't reach for her, didn't pull her in. Just opened them and waited, the way he waited for everything, with the patience of a man who understood that some things needed to be chosen, not taken. She walked into him, pressed her face against his chest, feeling the steady drum of his heartbeat through the fabric of his coat, and let herself be held for the first time in longer than she could remember. His arms closed around her, warm and solid and certain, and his chin came to rest on top of her head, and the bond between them flared bright and steady, and for a moment the world narrowed to the sound of his breathing and the warmth of his body and the impossible, terrifying, magnificent feeling of being safe. "I've got you," he murmured into her hair. "I've got you, Wren." The Iron Summit was nothing like she'd imagined. She'd expected coldness, grandeur designed to intimidate. Instead, it was a fortress carved into the mountain itself. All dark stone and high windows and fireplaces large enough to stand in, and the warmth of it surprised her. The people surprised her too. guards who nodded to Dominic with familiarity rather than fear, a housekeeper who took one look at Wren's travel-worn clothes and drew her a bath without being asked, a healer who checked the blisters on her feet and clucked disapprovingly and brought her soft boots that fit. The council did not surprise her. 7 men and 2 women seated around a stone table, every one of them looking at the border cartographer who had been escorted to the summit by their king, with expressions ranging from skepticism to outright hostility. She laid out her maps, the real ones, every survey, every territorial record, every water table measurement and soil analysis and migration chart she'd compiled over 3 years of walking the Grey Wild alone. She showed them what the resettlement orders had done, not with rhetoric, but with data, with the cold, irrefutable language of the land itself. She spoke for an hour. Dominic sat at the head of the table and said nothing, exactly as she'd asked, giving her the room to speak, the space to be heard, the silence that a woman like her rarely received in a room full of powerful people. When she finished, the eldest counselor, a silver-haired woman with sharp eyes and ink stains on her fingers, leaned forward and said, "Where did you learn to map like this?" "I taught myself." "No one taught themselves cartography at this level." "I did. Because no one else was going to map what was really happening to these territories. No one else cared enough to walk them." The counselor studied her for a long moment, then looked at Dominic. "She's telling the truth. These surveys are more detailed than anything we have." "I know," Dominic said. "I've seen her work. Lord Hale's resettlement orders are in direct violation of 3 territorial statutes." "I know that too." The investigation into Fennec Hale was launched within the week. By the end of the month, his assets were frozen, his territorial authority stripped, and the displaced families from the Ridge Village were offered the right to return to their land with full restitution. Wren provided the maps that proved every claim, every boundary, every acre that had been stolen and sold and built upon with the profits of displacement. She stood beside Dominic in the council chamber when the verdict was read, and she did not cry, because she'd already cried in a forest clearing in the arms of a man who waited for her to choose him, and the tears she had left were the quiet kind, the kind that came from relief so deep it felt like grief in reverse. 3 months later, Wren stood in a room in the Iron Summit that she still couldn't quite believe was hers. It had a drafting table by the window, the kind she'd dreamed about, wide and angled with light that fell across the surface like poured gold. Her maps covered the walls, not hidden in a cramped cottage workshop but displayed, consulted, argued over by counselors who had learned, grudgingly and then genuinely, to respect the woman who read the land better than anyone alive. "You're plotting," Dominic said from the doorway. She didn't look up from the survey she was inking. "I'm mapping." "Same thing with you." He crossed the room and stood behind her, close enough that his warmth pressed against her back like a wall of gentle fire. His arms came around her, careful not to jostle her working hand, and his chin settled on top of her head. She could feel his heartbeat against her shoulder blade, steady and slow. "The Western Ridge needs a new survey," she said. "The spring runoff shifted the stream bed." "Is this your way of asking me to go camping?" "It's my way of telling you the Western Ridge needs a new survey." He pressed his lips to her temple. "I'll have a team assembled." "I don't need a team. I need a horse and a week." "You're taking a team." "Dominic." "Wren." She set down her pen and turned in his arms. He looked down at her with those deep green eyes. And there it was, the thing that still caught her breath every time, the softness beneath the steel, the tenderness he showed no one else, the way his whole face changed when he looked at her, like she was a map of a country he'd been searching for his entire life. And finally found. "I love you," she said. He smiled. The full one. The one that had taken 3 months to earn and was worth more than every map she'd ever drawn. "I love you. Even though you cost me 3 days and a perfectly good horse." The horse was fine. The horse judged me. I could feel it. She laughed and kissed him, standing on her toes to reach, and he lifted her slightly, one arm secure around her waist, the other hand tangling in her hair, and kissed her back with the slow, deliberate thoroughness of a man who had all the time in the world and intended to use every second of it. When they pulled apart, she pressed her hand to his chest, feeling his heartbeat beneath her palm, and the compass needle pull that had lived in her chest since the first moment she saw him hummed with a contentment so deep it felt like music. "For the record," she murmured, "if I had to do it again, I'd still mark the map wrong." "I know. And you'd still follow it. Every wrong turn." He pressed his forehead to hers. "Every circle, every dead end, because they all led me here." She closed her eyes and let herself be held, and outside the window the mountains stretched toward the horizon in every direction, mapped and known and loved, and the world felt, for the first time in her life, like a place she belonged in.